platform or something there, Herb? Yes. A few weeks ago, I talked to you about the Red Ball Express. That was the resupply from Normandy to the front lines. Well, who supplied Normandy? Well, obviously it come from England, across the English Channel, a distance of a whopping 20-some miles. Well, there was no Red Ball Express in the war in the Pacific. It was a totally different program. A ship loaded in San Diego and would sail to Pearl Harbor, unload, and sail back to San Diego during World War II took 32 days. And that's just to supply Hawaii. What about the rest of the islands? Well, the distance from San Diego to Hawaii alone was 2,521 miles. The distance from Hawaii to Guadalcanal, 3,632 miles. The distance from Hawaii to Saipan, 3,858 miles. The distance from Hawaii to Iwo Jima, 4,000 miles. And the distance from Hawaii to the last island they took in the war in the Pacific, Okinawa, 5,000 miles. The war in the Pacific was a total different war than the war in Europe. For one instance, in Europe, the Allies took 3 million German prisoners of war. How many did we take in the Pacific? Less than 50,000. As you well know, the Japanese fought to the death. And there was one battle in the Pacific that drove home this point very well, and that was the Battle of Iwo Jima. More Marines were wounded and killed on Iwo Jima than Japanese were killed and wounded. It was the only time in the Second World War in the Pacific that more Americans were killed on an island than the Japanese. Interesting point. The Army Quartermaster Corps, they were in charge of the resupply in the Pacific. Right away, they had two huge major problems. First problem was President Roosevelt said, first, number one priority, where did it go? It went to Europe. Not to the Pacific, it went to the Europe. Number two, the Army didn't have a whole bunch of ships right after Pearl Harbor. The Navy was kind of hurting itself. They didn't have any ships equipped to handle what they needed, to move fresh food and things like that in bulk. Very few areas outside in the Pacific could handle supplies. They needed places to store supplies. It was food and clothing, equipment, petroleum. All of that needed to be stored. Well, there were only 3 places in the whole Pacific that had anything modern facilities to store that stuff. Australia, New Zealand, and Pearl Harbor. That's all there was. Now, it wasn't just the distance as a major problem in the Pacific. The salt water was a problem. The humidity was a problem. The heat was a problem. The torrential rains were a problem. Even the coral beaches caused problems. Do you realize that Marines on some of the islands, their eyelets in their boots would rust? If they wore them long enough, their boots would actually fall apart because their eyelets would fall apart. They come out with what they called, it was a tennis shoe kind of thing. They called it a jungle boot. They decided maybe that would be better than boots in the Pacific. Well, that didn't work very good either. They found out that the jungle boots, if they're in water very long, they just fell apart. They'd actually fall apart in less than 10 days. Uniforms in the Pacific didn't last long. The heat, the humidity, the dirt, the coral reefs. When they would take an island, they would bring in a pallet of fresh new uniforms. They would put them on the beach. They had a steel strap across it. They put a tarp across them. Well, what would happen? If the Marines didn't get to them quickly, the steel strap would rust. The tarp didn't give it any ventilation, and within a week, all those new uniforms were completely molded. Everything in the Pacific was tough. Even the cans of food they had in the Pacific would start to rust because of all the humidity. Now, the Quartermaster Corps in the Pacific, you all heard about C rations, but Quartermaster Corps had A rations, B rations, C rations, D rations, K rations, assault rations, jungle rations. They had all of those in the Pacific. A rations were fresh food. Less than 50% of fresh food delivered in the Pacific never made it to the troops. It spoiled long before it ever got there. Less than 50%. B rations, that was canned food that they would put together to make a meal. C rations, you guys all know what C rations are. Well, D rations were just more or less high energy bars or chocolate bars. K rations were for tank crews, airborne troops. Something quick, short duration. Assault rations, dried fruit, chewing gum, peanuts, salt tablets. Jungle rations were lightweight and they had to be dry. They had one item that worked real good in the Pacific. It was the poncho. It was rubberized. Almost every Marine and Army personnel in the Pacific wanted two. They made tents out of them. They covered foxholes with them. The poncho worked fantastically well in the Pacific. It got so bad that the Quartermaster Corps said, whatever works, just do it. They took Navy ships, old LSTs. Now, some of you don't know the nomenclature of Navy ships. LST, it's real tough. Stands for Landing Ship Tank. I've talked to you before about them. Flat bottom, front opens up like this and hold 20 tanks. You know what the Quartermaster Corps did with those things? They made floating drugstores out of them. After they took an island, they would pull up with this floating drugstore just off the beach. And the Marines and Army personnel, after they'd taken an island, they could come out on a duck and go out and get what they needed. Because, once they landed, what did they have to pack on their back? Sometimes it took 20, 30 days to take an island, even longer. They really didn't have much. So they needed to go to a floating drugstore. A few years ago, I talked to you about concrete ships and concrete barge. Some of you weren't around then, but they made one barge. They took $1 million and they made an ice cream barge out of it. Every 7 minutes, that ice cream barge could make 10 gallons of ice cream. It had storage enough on that barge for 2,000 gallons of ice cream. They towed that barge from ship to ship, beach to beach, island to island, just so troops could have a little taste of home. When I was reading about this, I learned that even bomber crews learned how to make ice cream in their bombers. They would take a container and put ice cream mix in it. They would put it in the tail section of a bomber. Now, flying at altitudes, what was a bomber? Pretty cold back there. Well, the vibration of the engines and the plane, when these planes got back to the land, they had ice cream. Even the troops in Europe were taking chocolate bars and mixing it with snow. And they had something very close to ice cream. Ice cream was kind of important in the Second World War. Not one landing in the Pacific during World War II was postponed or delayed because of the Quartermaster Corps and the resupply. The Army Quartermaster Corps did one fantastic job in a very, very difficult situation. Thank you, sir.